we're going to take a look at the history of some British biscuits. Many well-known examples are a fair bit older than you may have thought. This isn't going to be an exhaustive list, and we're just going to focus on biscuits which are still made today, but first emerged at least a century ago. So I'm afraid Johnny-come-latelys like the Jammy Dodger, introduced around 1960, won't be getting a look in. But we will be looking at some venerable classics like Rich Tea, Digestive, Bourbon, Garibaldi, Custard Cream, Nice and Ginger Nuts. Let's start with the Rich Tea. As arguably the plainest of all the biscuits available today, it would be reasonable to assume it's also the oldest. Various sources on the web talk of its 17th century origins, originally having the more humble moniker of simply tea biscuit. The earliest written reference I found of any kind of tea biscuit comes in 1787. Although this advert seems to be more focused on Dr. Oliver's celebrated Bath biscuit, it does also give a passing mention to the celebrated Montpellier tea biscuits, so much admired for their pleasing flavour and nutritious quality. Once we get into the 19th century, more manufacturers of tea biscuits start to emerge. In 1825 we have E. Phillips, who seem to be hedging their bets as to which hot drink their biscuits were suited to, coffee and tea. Get off the fence, E. Phillips. In 1839 we have Binion, also incapable of deciding which of two beverages his or her biscuits were suited for. In fact, it isn't until the 1890s, as far as I can tell, that the name Rich Tea, used to describe a style of biscuit, first emerges. And the very earliest mention I found is in New Zealand in 1895, a manufacturer called Allsbrook & Co. Following that, the earliest mentions in Britain seem to all be in Scotland, but not initially from the famous manufacturer you might first think of. In 1896 there's an advert for a company called William Lowe & Co, which was a chain of grocers and later supermarkets with branches throughout Scotland and northern England. It seems at this time they were also making their own biscuits, including a Rich Tea. In 1898 another Scottish grocer is advertising Gilchrist's famed biscuits, including a Rich Tea. And by the time we get into the early 1900s, it's a very crowded marketplace, with the likes of Macfarlane Lang & Co, another Scottish producer, advertising their Rich Tea biscuits in 1901, made in two shapes, round and oval. They also had illustrated adverts in that same year. Everybody is asking for Macfarlane Lang & Co.'s Rich Tea biscuits, we are led to believe. Wiley, or is it Willie, Barr and Ross, once again a Scottish producer, keeping it classy with a quote from Shakespeare and a note that their Rich Tea biscuits are baked on silver pans. Crawford, a brand which still exists today, yet another Scottish company, also starting to advertise their Rich Tea biscuits around this time. Another example where they're oval rather than round. Finally, in 1901, we see the first adverts for the brand of Rich Tea we're most familiar with today, McVitie's, also a Scottish company, and at this time it was a partnership, McVitie and Price. Some sources claim McVitie's Rich Tea biscuits were introduced in the 1890s, which could well be true, but either way it seems from fairly early on they had quite a lot of competition over Rich Tea biscuits, and all the action seemed to be happening in Scotland. Next, and perhaps the second most unchallengingly flavoured biscuit, the Digestive. The concept of a digestive biscuit, a biscuit designed to aid digestion, goes back to at least the early 1800s. One of the first to appear was the Abernethy biscuit. Abernethy biscuits contain caraway seeds, which are a carminative, something that aids digestion and is a remedy for flatulence. I feel a compulsion at this juncture to include some toilet humour, but this is a highbrow channel and I worry it might backfire. Other digestive biscuits crop up in the first half of the 1800s, including Busser's digestive biscuits, advertised here in 1836, approved of by medical men, and with the greatest amount of farinaceous nutriment that can possibly be concentrated into a biscuit. And Purcell's digestive biscuits, advertised in 1845, made of pure wheaten meal, ground especially for the purpose. These sound closer to digestive biscuits as we broadly understand them today, and they seem to be describing experimentation with the way flour is produced to make the end result easier to digest. Eventually, Huntley and Palmer, the biscuit giants of the 19th and early 20th century, threw their hat into the ring, with the earliest written references I found to their digestive biscuits being in the 1870s. They were based in Reading, representing one of the three Bs the town was famous for: beer, bulbs and biscuits. Their digestive biscuits are mentioned in passing as part of this 1878 article on fruit banquets. A 1909 full-page advert for Huntley and Palmer's oval digestives was impressively in colour, and they include a depiction of the biscuits themselves, quite recognisable compared to modern digestive biscuits. McVitie's, the best known brand of digestive biscuits today, were relatively late to the party, introducing their offering in 1892, according to their own website. The earliest newspaper advert I found for them was a decade later in 1902, and it's quite basic, but it notes that the late Queen Victoria was a fan. By 1915, they had upped their game a bit and were running front-page adverts on The Graphic, along with the bold claim that their digestive was the premier biscuit of Britain. The employee who came up with the recipe at McVitie's for the digestive, Alexander Grant, was a relatively junior member of staff at the time, but went on to become the managing director, and eventually a very significant philanthropist who played a major role in founding the National Library of Scotland. Next, ginger nuts. These are essentially a type of gingerbread. The use of the term ginger nuts likely goes back to at least the 18th century, and one of the earliest written mentions I could find was in an elegy for John Davis, a noted cake man. "Thy ginger nuts and butter buns bewail." A very poignant lyric, I'm sure you'll agree. Today, ginger nuts tend to be circular and of similar circumference to, say, a digestive biscuit or a rich tea. But the ginger nuts of the late 18th century were likely to have been more, well, nut-shaped, and thus the name. Although which particular nut, we're not sure. Probably ginger nuts is a contraction of gingerbread nuts, and slightly later in the 18th century there are adverts for gingerbread nuts as a vehicle for delivering Dr. Waite's celebrated worm medicine. What a time to be alive. By 1850, Huntley and Palmer were manufacturing ginger nuts as part of a lineup which still had one foot in the previous century. The cabin and captain's biscuits both being variants of ship's biscuits, quite possibly where this whole business of biscuits started. The Garibaldi biscuit is a sandwich-like arrangement where the filling is composed of currants, colloquially known as the squashed fly biscuit. It's named after the hero of the unification of Italy, Giuseppe Garibaldi, and they were likely introduced in the year of the unification, with the earliest mention I could find in print being November 1861. That cites the manufacturer as Peak Freen & Co., there's a typo there, who were a relatively new company at that time, established in Bermondsey in 1857, and survived in some form until the 1980s. Quite why exactly this particular biscuit is named after Garibaldi is unclear. Currants mostly come from Greece. They're not associated with Italy, and there is no record Garibaldi had any predilection for them. I suspect it was really all about the timing. The R&D department at Peak Freen & Co. had just prototyped a new biscuit at the time when Garibaldi was a very popular figure. Garibaldi had visited England a few years earlier, in 1854, and there's a possibly apocryphal story that during that time he sat on some biscuits, which was the genesis for this idea. Unsurprisingly, I did not find any contemporary accounts of the biscuit squashing incident, but there is a touching record of the working men of Tyneside clubbing together to buy Garibaldi a gold-hilted sword and a telescope, and I suspect he was more moved by that gesture than he was from having a biscuit named after him. Peak Freens were somewhat intertwined with Carlisle-based Carr's, the company who made Carr's table water biscuits. In 1860, John Carr of that family went to work for Peak Freens and became a partner in the business. There's a suggestion he may have come up with the idea for Garibaldi biscuits. Next, the Nice biscuit. And yes, I believe it is Nice rather than nice, and we'll come back to that later. It's rectangular, the corners are rounded, and the edges are crenulated. It's flavoured with coconut and there's a sprinkling of sugar on top. Usually today the word Nice is written on the biscuit, although that may not always have been the case. The earliest written reference I found to the name comes in 1904 in a full-page newspaper advert for Huntley and Palmer's biscuits, where they're highlighting the global reach of their products, which seems to have come as a surprise even to them. Nice biscuits were spotted for sale in a market in Lhasa, the capital of Tibet. If they had reached these far-flung corners of the world, that suggests they had already been around for a while, and some sources suggest they were first introduced in the 1890s. Nice biscuits were either an original creation of Huntley and Palmer, or possibly Australian biscuit maker Arnott's. So how did we end up with the name Nice biscuits? An advertising campaign from Huntley and Palmer's in 1921 appears to clear up any possible confusion as to whether it's Nice or Nice. As it says at the bottom, delightful as the town after which they were named. There's even a depiction of the biscuit here, which is very recognisable from how we see them today, albeit most notably, rather than the word Nice appearing on the biscuit, it's the name of the manufacturer. Interestingly, an advert for Arnott's just a couple of years later, in 1923, also shows a depiction of their version. Quite similar crenulated edges here, and again the name of the manufacturer, Newcastle being the town in New South Wales where the company was based. However, here the word Nice actually appears as well. So fairly early on we have evidence that at least the Huntley-Palmer version were named for the place. But why Nice? When we English people think of Nice, our first thought is often the Promenade des Anglais, the parade along the seafront, which is lined with palm trees. However, although there are a variety of different species of palm tree represented along the promenade, none of them are Cocos nicifera, which is the only species that produces coconuts. I suspect this was probably just a bit of marketing spin from Huntley and Palmer's, and it may tie in with the fact that Queen Victoria was a regular visitor to Nice each winter from 1895 onwards. Here's a caricature of her on a morning stroll through Nice, which appeared in Vanity Fair in 1897. It's possibly worth noting that Arnott's in Australia also introduced a Monte Carlo biscuit sometime in the 1920s, I believe, continuing on that Riviera naming theme. Next, the bourbon biscuit. Or should it really be Bourbon? This is a chocolate biscuit in a sandwich configuration with a layer of chocolate-flavoured buttercream in the middle. Wikipedia states it was originally introduced by Peak Friends in 1910 under a different name, Crayola, and didn't take the name bourbon until the 1930s. I'm not sure they've got their facts right. There are mentions of bourbon biscuits from Peak Friends as early as January 1894, listed at that time as a recent introduction. And I found no trace of a Crayola biscuit whatsoever in the newspapers. A 1912 advert for a shop in Tasmania lists items in a new shipment of Peak Friends' famous English biscuits, and we have the bourbon helpfully there described as a chocolate sandwich. I believe that is the bourbon biscuit we would recognise today. That chocolate sandwich description crops up again in 1915, 1925 and 1928. That suggests to me that all this business about Crayola biscuits and it not being named the bourbon until the 1930s is nonsense. Having answered the question of when it was introduced, perhaps we can turn our attention to why it has that name. Bourbon. If you were a biscuit maker in London, launching a new biscuit in late 1893, what would the word bourbon mean to you? Looking through the newspapers in that year, there's a few possibilities. There was a bombing attack on the Palais Bourbon, the French equivalent of the House of Commons, in December 1893, but that seems a bit too soon before that first advert in January 1894, and moreover a strange thing to prompt the naming of a biscuit. So I'm not convinced it's that. Earlier in 1893, Princess Margarita of Bourbon Parma had died, and there are many obituaries for her in newspapers in that year. She married Prince Carlos, also from a different branch of the House of Bourbon. There were those who believed Carlos and Margarita were the legitimate king and queen of both Spain and France, although of course neither of these ambitions were ever realised. So for a start, I suspect we should really be pronouncing the biscuit the French way, Bourbon, rather than the more typical way we do today, consistent with the American whiskey, bourbon, which incidentally does also take its name, indirectly, from the aristocratic House of Bourbon, the county of Bourbon in Kentucky having been named in honour of it. I suspect what Peak Friends were trying to say was that this biscuit really deserves to be king, or something like that. For what it's worth, of all the biscuits featured here, the Bourbon, or Bourbon, has long been my personal favourite. Let's move on finally then to the custard cream, which has always felt to me like a close cousin of the bourbon or bourbon. It's another sandwich biscuit, and it's the vanilla ice cream to the bourbon's chocolate ice cream, perhaps. Wikipedia suggests this biscuit was introduced in 1908 or 1913. Certainly by 1913 they were available in some far-flung corners of the world. Once again we have a shop in Tasmania advertising them in June of that year, and they note that they're made by our friends Peak Friends and Co. The wording sounds as though they were possibly newly introduced, at least to Tasmania, at that time. Your visitors will be sure to say they are most delicious. What do you call them and where do you get them? I couldn't find any mentions before this in the newspapers of custard cream biscuits, so perhaps that date of 1913 for when they were first introduced is correct. By 1920 there are adverts including a drawing of a Peak Friends custard cream, and you can see the design is very similar to how these typically look today, complete with the swirly foliate pattern and the name of the biscuit written in a diamond-shaped panel in the middle. In conclusion then, we've looked at some classic British biscuits and seen how many of them are a fair bit older than you might at first think. I think the bourbon in particular was quite a scoop there. We've learnt the name was in use over 30 years earlier than the internet would have you believe. Despite this long history and the fact that many people still have a warm nostalgic feeling towards these biscuits, I can't help but think that in the 21st century it's a bit of a sad state of affairs. Most of the companies who brought us these biscuits have been swallowed up by various mergers and acquisitions, and some have disappeared altogether. The Peak Friends and Huntley and Palmer factories were closed in the 1970s and 1980s, and the brands were done away with not long after. Yes, there has been a more recent effort to revive the Huntley and Palmer's brand, but it's a shadow of its former self. McVitie's does of course still exist as a brand today, and the biscuits are still manufactured here in Britain, although the brand is now owned by a large multinational called Pladis, who also own Jacobs and Cars, along with a bunch of European snack brands. So at least for now, the biscuits we most associate with McVitie's, like Rich Tea and Digestive, do seem to have a stable future. But some of the other biscuits we've looked at here have become generic products. Most of the time today, when people buy bourbons, custard creams, Nice biscuits and Garibaldi biscuits, they're probably buying a supermarket own brand version. And it's something of a race to the bottom. The supermarkets aren't competing on quality, they're just trying to churn them out as cheaply as possible. I challenge you to find a version of any of these biscuits which does not contain palm oil, for example. That certainly wouldn't have been on the ingredients list a century ago, and it's certainly not an ingredient that you'd use if you were baking these yourself at home. Whatever happened to biscuits made with butter? I'd love to see a bit more pride taken in these classic British biscuits once again. I hope that's been interesting. Thanks for watching.